So for this morning, we are going to skip over the portions that are solely focused on the law, because we've already discussed that in Leviticus. We've already taken time to talk about not just the law and how it functions, but also our relation to it now, right? So for Numbers, we're really going to hone in on the numbers that they're talking about and why they're important, as well as the stories that are happening in the text. Good? So we will start with counting, because that's where you start when you learn numbers, right? Counting, cute. I went through and typed it up of the numbers that they give us in the text, right? This is helpful for me just to see what we're talking about. I put all the tribes, I put the J's here because these are the sons of Joseph. Mm-hmm. So these are both, they each get an allotment, but they represent one son of Israel, right? So people will argue you should take the numbers together because even though they're separate tribes now, they both come from Joseph. Mm-hmm. And then Levi has a star because his allotment is different because they represent the priesthood. Okay, what sticks out to you looking at the numbers that we get?
Well, Levi's the lowest.
Levi's the lowest,
Judah
yep.
is the highest.
And who is?
Judah.
Good. Mm-hmm. Why is that? Theologically speaking.
Because Judah was blessed.
The argument, the idea is that God continues to be in control of giving life. In the same way that he gives life to like Sarah's womb to bring about Isaac. In the same way that he is credited for all of Israel's children with giving children to Leah, withholding children from Rachel, and then swapping in whatever else. God is attributed with doing those things. In the same way, he is attributed with prospering Judah, with giving them an increase in number, because Judah is the one that receives the blessing. Right? What else do we see? We talked about Levi having, significantly fewer, right? Anything else we see?
You may have to tell us what you're hinting at.
So, it's general observations. Benjamin seems very small.
Dan is like the second runner. I don't know.
I think Simeon. Dan, 62, look at that. The book also argued that because these both are attributed to Joseph, we should look at these together. So we should look at these as 72,000. Meaning, Judah is in first because he got the blessing, and Joseph is in second because he gets the birthright. Right?
Besides the fact that that's just fighting age men.
Right. These are fighting age men over the age of 20.
They don't include the women, children.
Correct.
So
because these are the ones that count.
Right.
Right.
Is that what you're looking for with the numbers?
I'm not looking for anything in particular. I'm just looking for observations. Benjamin strikes me as relatively small, particularly because we know how much Israel loved Benjamin, how much Jacob loved Benjamin. Who do we know that comes from Benjamin?
Saul?
The first king of Israel comes from the smallest tribe that's actually allowed to be the king, right? The Levites aren't really allowed to become the king. Like, it's just not really a possibility because they're the priests. So the next smallest is Benjamin, and that's the tribe that God gets the prophet to pick the king from, right? Who else do we know that comes from Benjamin? There's one other. New Testament.
Was it Paul?
It was Paul.
Huh.
Paul comes from Benjamin,
Interesting.
right?
This was also Saul. Sorry.
Yeah.
Saul, yes, both Sauls. It's a family name.
Both Sauls, yes, it's a family thing. Good correlation.
In both the Old and New Testament, it references, I come from Benjamin, the smallest of all the tribes.
Yeah.
Right? And we see the numbers that flesh that out. So it's interesting because Israel loved Benjamin, and Benjamin does not appear to be prospering as much. But does anybody remember what happens after the United Kingdom breaks up? So you've got Saul, the king, and then after him you've got David, and then you've got Solomon, and what happens,
And then it's split.
right? You've got Jeroboam
and Rehoboam.
and Rehoboam. Have we talked about this? They are not brothers. I thought for years that they were brothers because their names were the same. They're not. How do the tribes divide up in this?
Isn't one just Judah? Or no, not just Judah, but
And so the names of the first kings, we'll say, yeah, it is. It's the kingdom of Judah,
yeah.
right? So you've got the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel, right? We call this northern Israel and southern Judah, right? I think we talked about this a little bit when we went through our whole big history at the beginning of this class. Northern Israel is destroyed in the 8th century, 767 or something. They are wiped out, and I don't actually know if it's 767. One of the big bad guys comes in, wrecks them. They don't really recover. They're not really cast into exile so much as they're brought out, new people are brought in, and they're contaminated. That's why in Jesus' time, the Samaritans are considered like half-breeds. The capital of northern Israel is Samaria, right? And so they're considered half-breeds because of that, because the tribes are infused with pagans that come in and they crossbreed and they, whatever, like the biological terms that they would use. Judah lives a little bit longer. They go to 567, and they are brought into exile and returned. So like Ezra and Nehemiah is the return here. These guys don't come back, right? So these are, you'll read about like the lost tribes of Israel. That's coming from here, right? Which tribes are in this group? Obviously Judah.
Is it the half tribe of Manasseh?
I thought that too. I thought the same thing,
No.
half tribe of Manasseh, but it's not.
Or
The
even-
half tribe of Manasseh refers to the 2.5 tribes that take land east of
Right,
the Jordan.
right, Yeah.
So it's like Dan
It's
and
Reuben and
and half of Manasseh. Yeah,
yeah.
that's not related.
Okay.
I thought the same thing until I looked it up
Okay.
yesterday,
I
2 days ago.
I feel like I might be wrong, but I feel like Ephraim was in Judah if I'm not wrong. I am wrong. I don't know. I can't remember unless Benjamin was also.
As far as I know, it's Judah. The Levites, but they don't really have land, so it's debated if that like even counts. But because they're the priesthood and they're centered in Jerusalem, they're considered to be part of this. And who else? Who survives to Jesus' time? Which other tribe is around and people know I belong to this tribe? Benjamin. Benjamin. You should know how to spell it. So Judah, the Levites, which like, I'll put it in parentheses.
So the biggest in the two-lid list.
Right. So even though Benjamin appears to be like not really that blessed in terms of like the sheer numbers, they're the ones that end up on like the right side in that split at least. The way I understand it, when the split initially happens, it's just Judah and everybody else joins in the rebellion. And then Benjamin comes around pretty quickly and realizes that they're on the wrong side and they come back around. We lose sight of a lot of this when we get into like the minutia in Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, because it doesn't tell us this. It gives us names of people, expecting us to remember what family they're coming from or what tribe they're coming from. The Israelites who are reading this and writing this, they know these sort of details, and so they just don't give it to us. It's helpful for me to remember these sorts of things, even when we're looking at these numbers that are coming out, right?
But the Levites were spread all through, except for
Yeah.
like the cities that the conquest failed at,
Right.
which, eventually
The Levites are working everywhere, and they have land nowhere.
yeah.
Okay.
But like they got cities and they failed to take the city of Gezer, so the Levites were supposed to be in Gezer,
Right.
and then they were not because they never
One other thing of note, it appears that God is in control even of the numbers that are coming out here. If you remember from the book, from Numbers, God tells them to count, and like Jody said, these are fighting men who could actually work in the conquest. We're about to go to war, we're about to take over Canaan, we need to know how many people we have. They come out to the number. And then he asks for another number. I want to know how many firstborn sons there are in all of Israel. You guys remember this? And what's the number that comes out?
The same with Levites.
It's 22,000 and then 273 or something. And so God says, okay, you owe me 22,273 people because you owe me the firstborn of all of Israel. Every firstborn son is mine. Instead of taking the firstborn son from every tribe, from every family, I want all the Levites for myself because it's a comparable number. And then I think there's a mechanism for the extra 273 that you owe me. You guys got to come up with the money to pay for it. And so they offer a sacrifice that purchases back the 273 that they still owe God. But that's why the Levites are put in this position, is because their number is practically equivalent to the number of all firstborns for the rest of the tribes, right? Which again, I mean, some of us could say like, oh, it's purely coincidental. But I think it's to demonstrate that God is very much in control, even of these kind of very random numbers. God is in control to say, didn't it work out great for you guys that I'm going to take all of Levi instead of the firstborn son of every tribe, of every family, right?
Yeah.
And it seems like God is saying, I'm the one who worked that out for you.
Yeah.
Good? Any other questions on any of the numbers? No?
Is there anything else, because Levi seems like a weird choice given the Simeon Levi,
Uh-huh.
you know, when they were violent and kind of, or excused themselves from the right to be in Judah's position. Is there anything redemptive about that choice prior to God making it, or was it just him saying, this is what I want?
I don't know. It sounds like you're asking why God would choose them.
Well, it just seems like they had been on the not blessed side,
Right.
you know, and then they are then chosen for the opposite sort of assignment.
Right. Unclear.
Okay.
I imagine it's because Moses and Aaron are Levites.
Okay.
And so it's Moses and Aaron's family. It's Aaron's family that's
Okay.
chosen to lead the priesthood. So it seems like it becomes a familial job.
Okay.
I don't know. There could be more specific reasons than that. But as far as I know, that's the reason. Is because they belong
It's
to
the
that
family.
family.
Okay.
Yeah. It could be that they were already operating in that way prior to Moses, that the Levites had already taken that function, but I don't think we're told that. Because that would be, something that happens between Genesis and Exodus, and we aren't privy to any of that. Did you have a question?
Yeah. So in the book it talks about like the number of people that Israel had and like how implausible that is or something. Like, what do you think about that? I don't know, because I was reading that and I was like, because it was saying like there had to be like what?
2.5 million.
Yeah, like 2.5 million or something.
Yeah.
And then the book was like,
The authors of the textbook didn't feel it was absolutely plausible. It was a number to show how great God is. So
Yeah.
fluffing the numbers to show how great
yeah.
God is.
And then they were like other Near Eastern traditions like did that.
Yeah.
And blah blah blah. I just wanted to know what your opinion was
Yeah.
on that.
Let's see.
Because I don't know about you, but I feel like I'm always cautious when people compare like other traditions or like religion, like Near Eastern traditions or religions to the Old Testament. Because at least for me, I'm just like, but that's not the same. Like you can draw your comparisons and your conclusions, but it's not the same. Which I get like why you would do that to like take in the historical context that surrounds it. But I'm always like, I don't know about that one.
So I'm just trying to pull up demographics of the world.
Well, and half the argument is that the land couldn't have sustained them, but God sustained them, so it
Yeah.
doesn't really, that argument kind of doesn't fly with the manna and the water coming
Yeah.
from rocks and,
Yeah, I mean, there's parts of it where, it talks about why does God exist as a fire and a cloud in the desert wanderings?
Yeah.
It's to be a cloud during the day to protect them from the sun, and fire during the night to warm them up. If you have 2.5 million people, then for the fire to be hot enough to warm everyone up, it's going to kill people that are close enough, right? And so there's like the physical aspects that are not helpful. It looks like at 1000 BC, there's only 50 million people in the world, right? This is happening, Numbers is 1200 BC, 1400 BC, somewhere around there. And so the population is less than 50 million. So do we think, or the claim of the book would be that the Israelites make up a significant population of the entire world's population, right? 2.5 million out of, say, 40 million. That's a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a significant percentage of the world's population in a very tiny area, and they don't even have any land yet. They're wandering around in the desert, 2.5 million people. I think that's probably what the book is talking about. But I don't know what we're supposed to do with texts like this if this isn't the case,
Yeah.
right? I don't know what the symbolic meaning would be if it's not literal,
Yeah.
right? And I like to look at those sort of things. Like, I think we've talked about this before, the veil in the temple being torn when Jesus dies on the cross has a very specific symbolic meaning. The thing that's keeping us separated from God is now rent apart, so we have access to God. Whether or not, so when the author tells us that, he could very much be saying metaphorically, the veil in the temple that separates us from God is now destroyed because Jesus has died. But the physical reality that he's describing is only important because of the spiritual reality.
Yeah.
I don't know what the spiritual reality of this is if the physical reality isn't there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, it could just be, oh, God is making them prosper, and look at these big numbers.
That's kind of what the book says. It's like God's promise was to make them as numerous as the stars in the sky. So like
Yeah.
they fudge the numbers or whatever to make it seem like that, which I just hate
Right.
arguments like that.
Yeah. It could also be that the number comes later than we think it does.
Yeah.
That this is the numbers from decades later. It could also be that God is skewing it to where there aren't younger people. There aren't women. I mean, like, there are, but significantly fewer percentage. We come up with 2.5 million because we assume if there are 600,000 men over the age of 20, we assume there's an equal number of women, and there's a bunch of children, and there's a bunch of old people. Maybe God has arranged it to where it's not a 50-50 shot that you have a boy when you're pregnant. Maybe he's arranged it for this purpose, for the conquest,
That's interesting.
that 80% of the pregnancies for 20 years are men, are boys, so that they can grow up to take over. Okay? We have no idea. We also don't know if, imagine the difficulty of getting pregnant, coming to term, and giving birth during the Exodus,
Yeah.
right? So maybe the numbers of children under 20 are super low comparatively. And so we just don't know. And then there's a huge difference in saying there's 2.5 million people wandering around the desert versus there's 1 million people wandering around the desert.
Yeah.
So
Go ahead.
what were the numbers at the Exodus?
Are we told?
Because when you conceptually think of it, 2.5 million people leaving Pharaoh, sure he's going to be upset,
Yeah.
But then in the same sense, have you ever tried herding cats, let alone 2.5 million people, to get to go in the same direction all together in a timely manner? It takes me a week to pack and move, let alone just pick up and go. So you think 2.5 million people trying to cross the Red Sea and
keeping
settling
other goats,
out,
and
so
keeping
our-
other goats going the same direction
Yeah.
at the same time.
and everything, and the whole 9 yards. It's
So this is funny. I just Googled how many people left Exodus. So it's got footnotes and everything, and it lists 5 different scholars, and their arguments range from 5,500 people leaving Egypt during the Exodus, all the way up to 140,000 leaving Egypt during the Exodus, which is a vast difference. So one person says 5,500, one person says 20,000, 72,000, 140,000.
This one says 600,000.
Well, 600,000 is the number we've got now.
Okay.
At the kind of the end of the wandering. Actually, this isn't at the end of the wandering, is it?
No.
This is before the
This is
wandering
the first,
starts.
this is,
Yeah.
yeah, this is the first generation, which means that they were technically the people that left Egypt, or how many,
I mean, if
How
the
many
tribe
people
of
came of
Judah-
age since
yeah,
then?
came of age in Egypt, which Egypt was prolific, so they could have been kids.
I mean, if they had this many fighting
Right before
males
they left.
in Egypt at that
Wouldn't have
time,
been that
Right.
long ago.
It would make sense why Pharaoh wanted them
Only
to
people,
stay.
I mean,
but why couldn't they have
enslaved.
just?
not
Yeah.
really that long, you would have
I
had
mean,
what,
were they
16,
that
17
outnumbered?
or
Did the
12,
Egyptians
13,
outnumber
however
them
they-
that much?
whatever the age.
I can't imagine
And-
they
Can't
did.
imagine.
And they also said that the Hebrew women were were fertile or something. I don't know. Or was that the lie that the maids?
Well, we know that they were fertile,
Yeah.
which is why Pharaoh feared them.
Yeah.
The maids lied about them giving birth vigorously,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
that they didn't need.
So maybe there's something to be said about like what you said about how maybe the Hebrew women were giving birth to a lot of males.
And also, what did Pharaoh famously do that caused Moses to be given to Pharaoh's daughter?
Well, you killed
He's
them.
wiping kids out,
Yeah.
right? We don't know how long that happened or
Yeah.
the age range. Well, Aaron survived. Moses' generation did.
Mm.
So, like, if the people wandering around the desert, there's nobody Moses' age.
Mm.
Moses is the only man Moses' age,
Right.
Interesting.
right? We don't know how long that occurred. So
Yeah.
that could have wiped out 20 years worth of the generation. We just don't know.
That's-
So it could very much be that there are older people that are wandering the desert. God waits for them to die, and then the younger people come up, and there is still a gap of 20 years between the generations. We just don't know.
I had that same thought about Jesus, that if they
Right.
wiped out all the kids, he's walking around at 30 years old. There's no one else his age at
Right.
that point in
But I
time.
think for Jesus, it was much more localized.
Things
I
like-
think Herod knew the specific town to go and
Yeah.
kill all the babies in that town. As opposed to in Egypt, it was all Jewish boys. Anybody who's circumcised gets killed. And so I imagine it would be different because Jesus has colleagues, co-workers, the disciples are about his age. I guess they're younger than him.
Like 15 years younger.
Yeah, I guess
Yeah.
that's true.
I mean, but John
Um,
the Baptist was alive, and I mean, when you talk about him coming dressed and eating locusts, you kind of go, yeah, because they were hiding out. Like, his
Yeah.
Not John the Baptist. John the Baptist was
well, he was a,
eminently popular because he was the son of the high priest.
right, but they, I mean,
So he was spared because he wasn't there.
He wasn't in the town. I think it was Bethlehem,
Bethlehem. did.
which was a very like small. I don't think there were that many baby boys in Bethlehem at the time. I
okay,
think there were
I
some
had heard that happened at the temple as well. Like, the
killing the
soldiers
babies.
killing babies
Mm.
around the temple.
But we're not told
And
that.
I don't know.
I
if
don't
that's-
know.
I don't know historically
Right.
how true that is.
Right. Yeah. Any other questions on these? A lot of the questions that we're asking, we're not given the answers to.
How old is Moses during this right now?
He's up there, isn't he? I mean, he's
He must be.
he's like 80, isn't he?
Yeah.
Babies?
Because he's like 40
Exodus
when
and
he leaves
120.
Egypt, right?
He dies at 120.
You're right.
So here he must be 80,
Yeah.
right? I think he comes back to Egypt at 40, right?
Yeah.
And then, or does he? Yeah, he comes back at
There is
40.
a theory that there
Or does he
were
leave at
Mormons
40?
before
He
that.
leaves at 40 and
Yeah.
comes back at like 75 or 80.
Drinking poison.
Yeah.
And now he's wandering around at 80. And so I guess Moses wouldn't even be counted as one of the fighting men, which is funny. He's only counting 20 to 60.
And he didn't even have coffee.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm sure they had coffee.
Okay, let's talk about more. I was gonna say
Alright,
more
Numbers.
firm things, but they're not. It's so we've got some stories in Numbers to discuss, and there's a bunch of them. Let's look at this. Oh, it's not that. Oh, I pulled it up there. Let's see. Some stories. So let's start at Numbers 5. So everything before then is the counting. This is a strange story, and this is it's confusing and it is very debated about what's actually going on here. I'm sure we all read it. There's a test that God prescribes if a husband is concerned that his wife had an affair, and no one has no one has brought a legitimate accusation. He has no evidence. But they say it's a spirit of jealousy that comes upon the husband. We see this. This happens in, Hallmark movies all the time. So God gives a test that the woman goes through. It implies that it's not just that the husband is afraid the wife had an affair, but that the wife is pregnant and the husband is afraid it's not his baby. So you can imagine when you're arranged according to families and tribes in this way, and everything is familial, then knowing who the baby's father is important. And so the test comes in to do that. Now the question is, what does the test actually do to the woman to prove her faithfulness or infidelity? Right? What does the text tell us happens?
Well, her thigh drops and there's
Supposed to drink a concoction.
you drink the dust from the floor of the temple mixed with
Yeah.
some sort of.
So he pulls dust from the temple floor
Yeah.
and makes her drink it. Right?
It's mixed with something though.
Yeah, you mix it with.
Yeah.
I thought it was just dust and water, right?
It's like there's like an herb or something.
Wait.
It's called the water of bitterness.
Yeah.
Holy water in an earthenware vessel, and some of the dust that's on the floor of the tabernacle, and put it in the water.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay, I
So
thought there was
in
something else.
5:27, if she's defiled herself, the water that brings the curse shall enter into her and cause bitter pain, and cause her womb to swell, and her thigh shall fall away. What is actually happening? That's what's debated.
Yeah.
So our book goes through and does a good job explaining there has to be some sort of external physical thing for the priest to see to determine the results of the test. It can't just be that she feels pain inside. Something actually physically has to happen. This seems like an abortion. We would call it a miscarriage, but when you're forcing a miscarriage, that is an abortion. So we have to deal with that theologically, if that's what's happening. Again, our textbook did a good job of saying, we're not sure that that's what's happening. It could be that she gets like a distended belly.
Yeah.
Her belly gets bloated, and he sees that, and there's like something wrong with her legs. It seems like it's talking about something having to do with her womb and not just her belly, and something having to do with, I don't want to say her genitals generally, but something to do with her reproductive function specifically. It seems like she will not be able to have children. She becomes a curse to the people. And if she has not defiled herself, she's free and she can conceive children. That's what it says in 28. Then she shall be free and she shall conceive children, implying that if she's defiled herself, she shall not conceive children. Especially in our current political climate, religious climate, abortion is a huge issue coming up next month. Abortion is a huge issue for all of us evangelical, pro-life people. This passage comes up all the time. Rarely. You meet some people who say, well, I'm a Christian and I'm pro-choice, and I'm an abortion physician because I believe Jesus wants to give women these freedoms, right? There are people, it's rare. But people like that point to these texts and say, the Bible has a prescription for abortion in it. So how do we deal with that theologically when that's the argument that they're bringing?
Okay, I have so many thoughts. Okay,
Mhm.
first, there's nothing in the water that's like magic. It's just like holy water. Because I feel like that's what some people would want to say of like, oh, like if this herb was in it, this herb
There's
causes
a whole
But
there's a whole theory about the temple floor.
yeah, but
What would be in it and
yeah, I guess so. But like,
where they.
I feel like that whole like water thing was just like, okay, it's holy water in an earthen vessel, and there's dust on the floor that you put it in. Like if you think about that. It's like there's nothing about that seems like
There's no abortifacient that's being applied
like
to.
yeah.
Yes.
And so in my opinion, I feel like what's happening is like God. It's I'm reminded of like David, and when he sleeps with Bathsheba, the Lord is like, I'm going to take like your son is gonna die.
Yep.
And so because this one has like committed this like sin against the Lord,
Yep.
he is like, okay, if you like committed this adultery, then like I'm going to take away your. So if she miscarries, like I'm going to take away your child, and you're never going to have children again. So
Right.
like that's the curse.
Right.
And so I feel like it's unfair to say like that's abortion, like because I guess the guys are being like, you better get rid of that child because it's not mine. It's more like the Lord being like, you sinned grievously against me. This is the punishment. This is the curse that like you
Mhm.
have. And I feel like it's hard to explain that to a person who just wants to see this text and be like, look, there's abortion. People wanted to get abortions, blah blah blah, or
Right.
something like that.
But also at the end of the day, from our perspective, like theologically, it is a life, and they are
Yeah.
ending the life because of the parents' sin, right? And that is by definition the problem that we have with
I
abortion,
guess so.
right? Go ahead. Oh,
But in
Karen, you had
Jesus'
something.
time, the penalty for adultery was stoning, and you would have stoned the woman while she was still pregnant. So,
Right, but only if you have the evidence.
right,
Yeah.
but I just mean, still,
Yep.
she's still pregnant, and you're still killing her, which is going to kill the fetus.
Does it have to do with anything because it's from the tabernacle? Because only certain people could go in, and here they're drinking water with the dirt from the floor of the tabernacle.
So I guess like if that's kind of what I was thinking, like if she's pure, like if she's holy, like if she's not doing anything
Right,
wrong, then it's not
right.
gonna harm her.
I mean,
It
does
seems like
anyone
it's
else drink that
the
water?
curse, the oath that she's taking. That's the abortifacient, right? That's what she's taking upon herself and saying, if I'm lying, then I will receive the curse.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like there's actually a chemical in
Yeah,
the
yeah,
floor that's doing it. Because then if the woman is innocent and she's pregnant by her husband, it would, if there were a chemical in the
Yeah.
water, it would still kill her baby.
Yeah.
So it seems like it's a spiritual, you said magic. I mean, that's kind of what it is, right?
Yeah.
We would say it's spiritual, miraculous, whatever. It's magic. It's cultic magic that divides innocent versus guilty in terms of faithfulness to the marriage. And it's that oath and whether or not she's guilty that determines whether or not, in this case, it seems like that's what determines whether or not the baby lives.
I think, but what you can say about this is like, I think people will be like, well, isn't that abortion? Like God did the abortion or something like that. It's like, okay, but God is like the author of life. Like God has the ability to give life or take it away. Like that's it's not our responsibility to take on ourselves to say whether or not a life lives or dies. That's kind of what I think of when I think of like David and Bathsheba, and like when David's like baby dies, like the Lord took that life away. And to us that seems like really cruel and sad. I mean, it is sad, but in reality, like, or at least this is my opinion, of so many people have so many theological opinions, like the Lord took that life away, but like in my view I feel like that life is still like in heaven, like with him. But anyways, I just feel like it's not our responsibility to do
Right,
that.
but if you're taking that argument, then that argument would say, well, we don't need this test at all, because God would know if the woman was unfaithful and the child was a child of adultery, and God would just force a miscarriage without needing the test, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it sounds like to me like this is for the man because like he's the one with the jealous spirit, like, and this is like an accusation. Like it's not like she was caught, and so to me, like them doing this is opposing to like abortion today, where it's like females are like my body, my choice. I can do what I want with my body. This isn't her like. This is a horrible advocate for women being like my body, my choice, because this isn't like this is the man saying I'm jealous, and so I'm going to bring you to the temple to do this test because of my jealousy with no evidence. And there's nothing like this for the man. Like what happens if the female has a jealous spirit? Like there's no test for that. Like this is purely like a man saying, hey, like this is my jealous spirit, and so now we're gonna go do this test. So horrible,
Yeah.
you know, for women to be like, oh, you
But I
know.
also feel like in a way this is like protection for women
Yeah.
because like what if the man was just like, I'm jealous and I think that you slept with someone and then he like
Yeah.
killed his wife or something like that.
Yeah.
I feel like this could also be protection for the
Yeah.
woman being
God's
like,
provision,
yeah.
like I care for you, so here's this
so here's
test.
this test that your husband can take so
Yeah.
he doesn't kill you because
Yeah.
he thinks that you slept with someone or something
Mhm.
like that.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, so I understand what you're saying. At the end of the day, the argument is much more on the specific issue of God is telling people to kill babies in the womb for theological reasons, right? I mean, that's what it comes down to. And that, I think, is like the purest thing that we have to wrestle with, is if we hold this God thinks all babies in the womb are precious and all of them deserve life, then we have to square with these texts where that does not seem to be the case, right? Where God is telling them, kill the babies in the womb so they don't mess up with like the inheritance or the family name or whatever else. I agree that there are differences in the reasoning, and it's because of the men that are doing this, and the women are kind of forced into it by their husband and by the priest, which is different than the reasoning behind what we see now. But the actual results seem to be the same. I think you had your hand up earlier.
I forgot that question. For what you're saying now about like God killing the baby in the womb, wouldn't that just be like showing God's mercy that baby wouldn't be born into a family that would then cast it out or kill it once it's already like out of the womb, which would probably be, I don't know, it's fire. But wouldn't that be God's mercy that instead of having to live a dreadful life of like your family has exiled you because you were born of another man, that instead it's the mercy of like you get to go, like you get to stay in heaven essentially.
But isn't that the same argument that modern pro-choice people make now? If your kid in the womb has Down syndrome, it would be better to just abort them rather than let them live a terrible life. If your kid is going to be born into poverty and you can't feed them, it would be better to just abort them so they can go to heaven and then they won't have to suffer in this life. I mean, that is the same argument that people are making now that we tend to disagree with,
Yeah.
right?
But I guess, well,
I
Go ahead.
still feel like it's still our choice against God's choice because you don't know what somebody is able to overcome regardless of what they're born into and their health or their situations or whatever. Like there are people who rise from nothing to everything, and just like there are people who have issues who can accomplish great things. Like it's still your choice what you think is possible against what God's plan is. Like we look at a linear timeline of what you're based off your restraints or whatever, and God doesn't see it like that. So it's still our choice versus His choice.
yeah, I think like, yeah, just to back up like what you're saying, I said this before, but it's like, okay, but we can't play God. Like, we can't be the ones to decide whether or not to give life or to take it away. That's like a sin. And in this case, even though it seems like they're using human means to do this, it's ultimately like God.
It's because God is passing the priests are operating on behalf of God.
I guess, well, ultimately, like, it's the Lord who does it, right? And not people. But I also wanted to say it's really important I think in this verse to say, like, I don't think, at least what I'm reading and like what I read earlier, like, it doesn't mention pregnancy at all in here that she has, like, that she's pregnant. It doesn't say that. And so I think you can conjecture all you want about this passage, but nowhere in here it only talks about like her defiling herself and like all these things. It doesn't say that she's pregnant. Maybe she is. I don't know.
I think it's the reference to the womb and the thigh, as well as whether or not she can conceive children.
But maybe that just means that like she's gonna be barren
Right.
for like the rest of her life. Maybe it doesn't even have to mean that she's already pregnant. Maybe it just means like she's barren for the rest of her life or something. I don't know. It's
Forced sterilization.
yeah. I mean, I think
You
this
have
is
your hand up as
the
well.
same ground as
I was
And
just
then
gonna
Joe.
say, like, it makes me think of like just the close proximity with God and how like it made me think of like Ananias and Sapphira, and the reason like they dropped dead like was because in that time, like they were, like the people were in such close proximity to God, and so like with the Israelites, like they're experiencing all this like divine power and presence of God, and so where was I going with this? So I was just thinking about how like, well, they died because of a sin, being in close proximity, because just the nature of God
Right.
is so like so holy and so mighty that like I feel like it makes the sin like you're in the presence, and so the sin is just so much more intense because you're experiencing God at such a close proximity.
Yeah.
So
Jody, you had a thought as well?
I want to be a pop star here real quick.
I mean, that's what I've been doing for the last 20 minutes.
Yeah.
This really feels now male dominated.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like a scare tactic. It's put
Yep.
out there, and hey, let all your wives know.
Yep.
If
We'll
you're
find
thought-
out. Yep.
We'll find out.
If we don't catch you in the act, we'll find out later.
God will provide the water and the dust,
Yep.
and the truth will come out. So it almost seems, because it doesn't say, it says, Lord spoke, speak to the people, if any man's wife goes astray and breaks faith with him.
Yep.
So it
And we
doesn't
never
say-
see it happen.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, what do you think the incidences of this happening? Was this set out and they go, and he goes, and his wife, and the man says to all his wives and say, listen,
Yep.
God will reckon with you if you do this.
Yep.
So,
Well,
there is
so don't,
there
yeah.
is
So
also-
who's to say the water really is gonna do
Yeah.
everything, but it's more of a judgment, because you could almost imagine this woman being drugged over to the temple or to the tabernacle. I didn't do it, here, drink this water. And then she says, wait a minute, I'm innocent.
Mm-hmm.
I can drink the water, nothing's gonna happen to me. Sure, I'll get a little gas, because you're drinking whatever.
Right.
Right.
But in the reality, if she's guilty, she's really gonna throw it out there to
Yeah.
say that it was. I mean, who's gonna say it's, because
Yeah.
here they say miscarry,
Mm-hmm.
having a miscarriage, it says nothing about abortion, it says nothing about that point, because most
Right.
miscarriages happen.
Well, there's also a lot of talk about Joseph actually would have had the right to do that to Mary.
That's what I was just going to say next, was the Jesus of it all. When Joseph finds Mary pregnant, he resolves to divorce her quietly to save herself from the shame. He had supposedly this legal right because the temple exists, and he knows that she cheated on him, right? Even though they weren't technically married. He doesn't have any mechanism to catch her in the act, obviously. So this is the legal remedy for him. And instead of doing this, he resolves to do it quietly. When he decides to marry her, when the angel comes and talks to him, he absorbs public shame for it, right? There's speculation that some of the times when Jesus is ministering and people say like, isn't this Jesus? Isn't this Joseph's son? That they're not really saying, oh, we know where he comes from. They're saying, isn't this Jesus? Isn't this Joseph's son? And they're bringing that issue up again of Joseph has absorbed public shame. Either he and Mary had sex before they got married, or Mary had an affair and Joseph didn't care about it. And so we know Jesus is not Joseph's son. And so isn't this Joseph's son, right? All of this goes back to these sorts of things.
Yeah.
Like we said, we never see this actually practiced. Just like the year of Jubilee, right? Every 7 years, all the slaves are freed. That is never actually carried out. It's never actually practiced. Same thing here. We could use that as an argument. I don't know that it helps threatening an abortion instead of like actually carrying them out. I don't know if that helps with the
abortion
argument.
aspect of it. It's
Right.
the call to admission.
Sure.
When your hands are put to the fire, the admission at that point.
Right.
Because if they said the water will cause their belly to drop in their throat,
Right.
so they believe it.
Yep.
So therefore, when she's But being brought up there, she knows she's either guilty or innocent. If she's not, she's fine. If not, she's going to be making a big ruckus going up there.
Yes, and for a woman to be barren in that day, like if
Yeah.
I'm a woman like knowing this and I actually did it, I'd be like, I'm not drinking the water.
Yeah, and you would fight till the
yes.
end not to drink that water.
No, literally, because being barren was like a curse.
Yeah.
It literally in here, like it's a curse.
Right.
It's like a social death sentence, basically.
This is fun. Talking about it.
Yeah.
Let's keep moving forward because we are running out of time. Number 6 describes Nazarite vows. Who do we know that's a Nazarite?
Gee,
Solomon.
Samson.
Samson. Sorry, what is it?
Samson?
Some Nazareth, they said it had no.
Samson.
Samson. Who else? One more Old Testament, one New Testament.
Was it? Did they say that?
Right, that was at some point, right?
Paul takes some sort of temporary
Some
vow,
sort of vow.
Yeah.
but we don't know for
I don't
sure.
believe it.
Samuel took a Nazarite vow.
Samuel.
Yeah.
Samuel and Samson are the 2 Old Testament guys. Who's in the New Testament? We already talked about him, I think.
John the Baptist.
John the Baptist. Right? No drink from birth, no shaving his head from birth. Right? Those are the 3 that we know for sure are Nazarites. In any sort of long term. It's prescribed as like you can do this in a short term way also. Those 3 seem to be long term or lifelong Nazarites. We landed in Sinai a long time ago, like Exodus a long time ago. We are finally leaving in Numbers 10. And so they finally take off. By the time we get to chapter 11, the Israelites are already grumbling again. This time they're grumbling about meat. You know, we've been eating this miraculous bread forever, and we're so sick of it. We want bread. We want meat. And then what happens in that story? The quail comes down, and it's like they're like 3 feet above the ground, and they're like blind and confused, and there's millions of them. So you could just walk up and just like hit one and bring it home.
Yeah.
And then what happens when they eat the quail?
They get sick.
It burns in their mouths, right? Because it comes from gravel. This is important. Spies are sent into Canaan, and what happens? They send, I think, 1 guy from each tribe, right? Plus Joshua. It seems like we're told later that he's there, but he's not the guy named for his tribe, so there's at least 13 guys, it seems like. What happens when they go and spy on the land? What do they come back and say?
There's giants.
It is.
They say, it's great,
It's great.
and we can't do anything to take it. There's Nephilim there, right? Which we talked about this before of like, when we were in Genesis, what are we talking about? It seems like they're,
They call them Anunnaki here, right?
yeah, it's Nephilim, the children of Enoch or whatever.
Yeah.
It seems like they're lying, like they're not really giants in the land. They're exaggerating and saying, "Oh, we're never going to be able to take it." There's like giants there, and we look like grasshoppers in their eyes.
That's what our text said about the Hebrew word, the diva or whatever it was in the Hebrew was like a false report.
It says a bad report. It doesn't mean negative. It means the report is bad. Like it is not a truthful
Like
report.
it's false.
Yes. But what I mean by that is like, yeah, it seems like they're exaggerating the strength of the Canaanites. Except for who?
Caleb and Joshua.
Caleb and Joshua. Who is it that gets to live and go into Canaan?
Caleb.
Caleb and Joshua, right? Everybody else does not get to, right?
And then
So-
Caleb is an old guy, kills 3 giants to get him out of his land when he gets his portion.
Who's that?
Caleb.
Yeah. So in response to the bad report, there are two paths. Most of the people say, let's choose somebody else and let's go back to Egypt. Let's get a different leader, kick Moses out, and we will get somebody else to take us back to Egypt where we can be content in slavery. Versus Joshua and Caleb who say, if the Lord delights in us, he will take care of it. He will bring us into the land, and we don't have to worry about everything else. Even if it's giants and angels and whatever, if the Lord is on our side, we'll be fine, right? This sentiment is not the one that prevails, right? Most of the people agree with the false report. What is the repercussion of this?
Will they wander in the wilderness and die?
Right. None of the men who have seen my glory and the signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, who have put me to the test these 10 times, probably an exaggeration. I don't know that there are 10 specific times that God is thinking of, probably a representation of totally rejecting him. If they've now not obeyed my voice, none of them shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers. None of those who despise me shall see it. Except Joshua and Caleb. They're the only ones. Aaron doesn't get in, Moses doesn't get in. It's these two. And they lead the charge for the next generation, right? This is what causes them to go into the 38 years of wandering in the desert. Is this right here. This is the rebellion. They've decided to overthrow Moses and bring somebody else so that they can go back to slavery. And when they decide to overthrow Moses, they're really saying, we don't want God. We're rebelling against him, right? Let's keep going. More stories. Talk about this for a second. I find this interesting. So in Numbers 15, it prescribes the Lord speaking to Moses, speak to the people of Israel, tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a cord of blue on the tassel of each corner. It shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord, to do them, not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes, which are inclined to whore after. That's what my translation says. Why do I bring this up? Why is this important? Anybody? Anybody have any idea what we're talking about here with these tassels? What are we talking about?
They're a memory they wear in significance of the Ten Commandments.
Don't they also put on the priests? Also, is this like Hebrew wordplay?
What do you mean?
Like, it says, I feel like that it just has the phrasing of like, tassel also means something else in Hebrew, but I don't think that's true. But it says, it shall be a tassel for you. Like, what does that mean? I mean, I guess it just literally means like a tassel for you to look at.
In addition, yeah, a reminder. If you see like modern Jews, they have prayer shawls. They have these tassels on them, right? The fringe at the end of them are tasseled for this reason, right? There's one other instance that I'm thinking of. We know historically that other people had these, particularly in the first century. Why is this important?
That's significant. Well, I mean,
Who's running around in the first century?
The Pharisees and the Sadducees.
And who's like the main guy who's running around in the first century? It's like the easiest answer.
Like you're talking about
Jesus.
Oh.
Thank
Some
you.
just don't answer.
Yes.
In the Old Testament.
When the woman who's suffering for years
Oh yeah.
comes and touches Jesus, what does she touch?
The hem, or I guess it's tassel.
The fringe. This is what it is. It's the tzitzit is what it's called in like currently. But there's fringes on his garments that she reaches out and touches. This is what we're talking about. This is it. I don't know. I'm sure they have them before this. I can't think of other stories where it comes into play. It comes into play here. She's reaching out and touching the reminder that Jesus wears to obey the Ten Commandments, and that's what heals her, right? I think it's
Well,
fascinating.
Megan is kind of right, isn't she? That like the blue relates back to the ephod, relates to the blue, and
Yeah.
King Ahasuerus, in Esther, the blue.
I mean, blue, yeah, is
royal color.
sure. Yeah. We have another rebellion because they happen all the time. The result of this rebellion is all the leaders, everybody bring your best stick, and we're going to put all the sticks together and see what happens. Aaron's stick goes forward with all the other sticks to try to find out who the real leader is. Aaron has a dead stick, right? It is a walking stick. What happens to it? What does that mean?
Life.
It comes to life, it blossoms, and it grows almonds out of his stick, which is nuts, right? And his is the only one that does it. I mean, that's super weird.
It's the same as Sarah.
Right. It's actually probably way easier than Sarah, right?
Yeah.
The function is to prove that Aaron is still working for God, that Aaron is the one who's still chosen, right? Aaron's staff is what ends up in the Ark of the Covenant, right? 10 Commandments, jar of manna, and now Aaron's staff. Those are the three things that are in there. Good? Numbers 20, Moses strikes the rock, which apparently is a big deal.
Isn't the big deal really that he says, must we provide water for you?
I think so.
Yeah, but God said, speak to the rock, and he beat the rock.
Right, but when he hit, I mean, he disobeyed God,
And he
and
did it out
then,
of anger, I think, right?
yeah, but then he said to the people, must we provide water for you, or something, there's an equation of himself as
So,
being
Numbers 27:14,
with
God speaks to Moses and says, because you rebelled against my word in the wilderness, talking about this, failing to uphold me as holy at the waters before their eyes. So that is the sin, failing to uphold God as holy. We don't know exactly what that means. Some people say it's anger. I think it is probably because he's trying to take credit.
Well, that's the we, is, I mean,
Right.
the.
Like, Moses is the one who's
God,
bringing the water.
yeah.
I think the striking the rock, I don't know that it's out of anger so much as so that he can be attributed with getting the water out of it. Oh, you guys want some water? You want me to get water for you? Watch this. Boom. Right? Even though he had already struck the rock before. So some people say, oh, well, he was living on what God had done for him in the past and not what God had told him to do this time. Right? God told him to strike the rock before, and that's what he knew, and so he was living in the past and not living in what God had for him now. I don't know that that's what the text is trying to tell us. In some way, it seems like Moses is also trying to put himself as the leader of the Israelites, which he is not supposed to do.
I would say I see that almost more as Moses' response to Korah's rebellion, because Korah's rebellion was kind of like a big deal.
Yeah, I think like 14,000 people died. So this, I wrote this on my notes here. Korah's rebellion reminds me of Lord of the Rings. If anybody's familiar with like is anybody watching Rings of Power, the TV show? No? People, they spent $1 billion on it, and it is not.
It is awful. My parents are watching it, and I'm watching it like, what's happening?
I enjoy it a lot, because I like the lore and the Silmarillion and all that sort of stuff, so I'm enjoying it. I don't know that I'm enjoying $1 billion worth of it. Anyway, in the Lord of the Rings, this is before like the Fellowship of the Ring and Frodo and the Ring and all this sort of stuff. This is way before. In the stories, the angels that live over in the west, in Valinor, they have elves and everybody else, and they send armies to come and fight Morgoth, who's like the big bad guy before Sauron. And there are men that are loyal to the angels, to the Valar, and they come and fight alongside them to try to help defeat Morgoth. Eventually they defeat him, they capture him and send him into the void or something. And in response, the men are given an island called Numenor. They're given long life, and they have this like beautiful civilization. Numenor is like the civilization before Gondor, right? So Gondor is descendants of Numenor. In the Rings of Power right now, we see Numenor. What happens at the end in Numenor is bad guys start to take over. They're called the Black Numenorians or the Kingsmen or something. And they start to say, well, the Valar really hate us. These angels who gave us this island, they really hate us because they didn't make us immortal like they made the elves immortal. So they gave us long life, but we don't care for that. So these morons decide to get their armies together and build this massive fleet and go sail on Valinor and try to kill the angels in Valinor. So they like declare war on heaven, essentially, and say we're going to sail our armies and try to take over. So they land at Valinor, and the angels start like praying, calling out to Iluvatar as God in the realm. And Iluvatar like opens up a chasm and just swallows the whole army and all the ships and just sinks them into nothing. Just like and then he sends a big huge wave and just destroys all of Numenor, wipes it all out in one thing. This reminds me of what's happening here. Is like they're rebelling against Moses, which is really a rebellion against God, and it's so foolish, it's so moronic that God just like opens up a chasm and sucks them all in, and they're just gone. It's not even a fight. It's not even like Moses has to get his fighters to fight Korah. It's over. It's so foolish that they're doing this. And then a plague breaks out and kills 15,000 people. because they sided with Korah against God, against Moses, right? It's supposed to be foolish. It's supposed to appear to us nonsensical, moronic, right? I read it and I thought, oh yeah, this is exactly what happened. Questions on this? I've got 3 more stories. And hey, we've still got 12 minutes. We're doing
You're
great.
doing great.
And I've still got a little coffee to keep my throat going. Okay, bronze serpent, Numbers 21. Why do we know about this verse? Why does anybody know about this verse? I mean, like, it seems weird. It's picturesque, right? Like, it's vivid. But why do we New Testament people remember this?
Is it medical symbols?
It's medical stuff.
It is in medical symbols. You're right.
Sorry, I was trying to get it out. Same time you said.
You're right. Yeah. I didn't even think of that. That's not the answer I was looking for. But yeah, in medical symbols, it's like I'm never going to be able to draw a snake, right? But it's like the big.
That's a dollar sign. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, there we go.
I put a little face on
I think
it.
there's 2 snakes.
Are there
snakes
2?
And they meet at the top. There, you're
Okay.
getting closer.
Yeah. We're getting there. and I haven't seen a medical symbol in years, so this isn't right at all. But this is what we're talking about. I think this is also, it has pagan imagery in it too, right? It's like it's supposed to be a staff of some like pagan god of healing or something. And also the snakes. You're right about that. I'm thinking of something more biblical.
I'm trying.
The cross.
Eve's
The cross.
The serpent.
The cross, kind of,
Kind of,
ish.
yeah.
Jesus-y. We're in the right ballpark. Anybody?
Well, the healing part of the cross.
Healing
yeah.
part of the
Crush on the head of the snake.
Crush the head of the snake. No, it's not Mary.
No, Mary, no.
Where does this story show up in the New Testament?
I'm trying to find it.
I
I
remember
think
showing up
if
with
I'm
that
right.
there.
Wait, hold
Okay,
on,
think
hold on.
about who's asking the question.
Oh, it's in John.
It's in John, obviously.
Yeah.
Well, we should
No,
have
isn't
you were
doesn't
smiling.
Jesus say like Moses would raise up the staff in the wilderness or something like that?
Yes.
And it's in John 6, isn't it? Or
It's
am I
John 3.
crazy?
John.
So
Oh,
right
John
before
3.
John 3:16.
Yeah.
John 3:14 and 15 is just like Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up.
Yeah.
All who believe in him would inherit eternal life.
Yeah.
Right? And then he goes into what we all know, John 3:16. He brings up this passage. Now, have we talked about this passage or John 3 in this class or any of our previous
Not
classes
really.
together? Okay, I'm just going to talk about it for a minute. This is what I wrote my dissertation on. So, in the story, Moses, first, there are people rebelling, serpents come, they bite the people. They bite the Israelites. They're dying of poison. What is he told to do in response?
Make the staff, and if the people look at it,
Uh-huh.
then they're healed.
Uh-huh. And what is it that's on the top of the staff?
It's the bronze serpent head.
Okay. It's a fiery serpent. I think the fiery refers to like the poison of the real serpents. So my question is, does Moses catch one of the serpents that bit somebody, or does he make his own? He makes his own, right? He doesn't like catch one of them and nail it to the stick and then lift it up and say, behold, right? He makes his own. So the question is, when we read John 3, most of us and most kind of modern commentators argue that that Jesus is saying, in the same way that Moses lifted up the serpent, the Son of Man is going to be lifted up on the cross, right? And if you believe in him on the cross, you'll be saved, right? I don't think that's accurate. I don't think that's what it's talking about. Moses does not catch one of the living snakes and put it up on the staff and say, I've now crucified one of them, and if you look at it, you'll be healed. He makes his own. I think in John 3, what Jesus is talking about is much more closely related to the incarnation than pointing forward to the crucifixion, which isn't going to happen for 15 chapters. I think what he's saying is, in the same way that Moses formed an image representing the thing that was plaguing the people, God has formed an image representing the thing that's plaguing all of humanity, right? Our human bodies, our human
Humanity
flesh,
itself, yeah.
humanity itself, right? And he has made an image, and if the image of Jesus is exalted, is lifted up, and you believe in that, you will also be saved, right? That way, when you get to John 3:16 and he says, God so loved the world, he gave his only son, he doesn't mean gave his only son on the cross. He means gave his only son here, now, for us to behold as the exact representative of God. So for me, I look at John 3:16 as like a Christmas passage. That God displays his love for us in giving his son in the incarnation.
Yeah.
Right? As a representative of himself. The cross will come later as the mechanism by which we are actually justified, by which we can actually benefit, by which we actually come into relationship. But the point of it is relationship. The point of it is acknowledging Jesus as God, right? The cross isn't the point of it. The cross is the means to get there. Does that make sense?
So would you then see it that if Moses lifts up the image of Satan and you're healed, then how much more when the image of God is held up?
I don't think anybody thought this was the image of Satan. Even in Genesis, the serpent isn't called Satan. It's just called a serpent. It's not until way later that people start to say that serpents are, even the serpent in the garden. It's not until way later,
Well,
like after
no,
the New
but
Testament.
I meant the relation of the serpent to the serpent in the garden.
Right.
The,
I don't think anybody.
The bringing of curse, whether
Right.
you call it Satan or not.
Right. I think the idea is, it is not the thing that saves them. It's the belief that when they obey God, God will cure them. That's what saves them, right? It's not the
No,
there,
it's not
there's
that.
no
There's
supernatural magical thing that's happening by what Moses is putting up.
Magic lint that
Right.
glints off the bronze that touches their eyes.
Right.
touches their
It's
brain,
the
and-
faith
Yeah.
by which they believe what they're told and obey that gets them cured. Right? And in the same way, we believe Jesus is who he says he is, and we obey his teachings even while he's on earth, even before the crucifixion. Jesus, throughout the Gospel of John, is saying these things. You can have life now. You will have eternal life now and move from death to life today if you believe I am who I say I am.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with the cross. When he's calling people to believe, he's not telling them, believe that I am going to die on the cross and resurrect and forgive you for your sins. That is not what he's telling any of them. That is much more like Paul coming along and saying, this is the mechanics of what's happening, right? Jesus isn't interested in that. Jesus is saying, you need to believe that I'm going to take care of it. And I'll figure out the mechanics myself. You just need to trust me to do it, right? I like this passage. But it's because I like John 3.
That's good.
We all know this story, right? Because it's super weird. I mean, like the donkey talks to Balaam, right? It's very strange. I don't know. I feel like we're all familiar with it. I don't know that there's any more stuff to get into about that passage, unless anybody has stuff to
Later
point
on,
out.
it mentions that Balaam was killed. That's all. Later on,
Oh, does it? I don't remember that.
yeah, it's straight up. It just says it was something, and Balaam, son of
Beor, yeah.
was killed with a sword. And it
Okay.
just
No, I believe you.
because I went back and I'm like, wait a minute, they had so much about him, and then there's one sentence that,
Yeah.
and later on in one of
It
the
just
wars,
kind of pops out.
pops out,
Yeah.
he was killed with a sword.
Yeah. I'm not sure how we're supposed to read him. I assume we're supposed to read him negatively. It seems like he really wants to curse Israel
Yeah.
and is prevented from doing it. But then we also have the problem of like, God tells him it's okay, you can go with them. And then God punishes him for going with them.
Well,
Right?
it almost seems like just an image of greed.
Yeah. Yeah. And he's not a Levite, right? Like he's not a priest or a prophet, and he's not a Jew, as far as I know. He's like a pagan priest, prophet,
Yeah.
sorcerer kind of guy, and God happens to speak to him sometimes. The real God happens to speak to him sometimes. I'm not sure how we're supposed to read him at all. It's a very strange story. It seems to be that the whole point is that God is still in control, even with all this other stuff going on. God can make donkeys talk to get his point across, to get his will accomplished, and no one is going to curse Israel because he has control.
Yeah.
Right? It seems to be the point. I don't know much more than that because it's
Well,
a very
creation-
strange.
I mean, creation obeys him regardless, kind
Right.
of, yeah.
He gives a bunch of oracles. I mean, he goes for chapters.
He does. It's a long. Like,
And then at the very end,
he really tries to get, like you said, to that.
right.
Hmm.
At the very end, Joshua ends up succeeding Moses. We saw this coming, right? We saw this coming from a mile away, right? Joshua is the one who Moses leaves the tent of meeting, and Joshua stays behind, right? Joshua stays there with God, while Moses is off, like, leading the people. Joshua has been well trained. Joshua has been well stationed. Joshua, we already saw, was faithful in the report of the land. He is well positioned to take over. And, the rest of Numbers is...
The first time we see Joshua is in the battle where Moses raises his arms, right? Have we seen him before that? Is there anything about him before that?
I don't recall. I don't remember.
Because he leads
I think
that
he's
battle.
introduced.
He leads that battle. but-
Joshua does?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, but he's leading the fighting while Moses is on the hill, raising and lowering his arm.
Right. I don't recall if we hear about him before that. I thought the first time that we heard about Joshua was Moses left and Joshua, son of Nun, stayed in the tent. I thought that was the first time that we heard about it,
Well, I know he led the battle.
but I could be wrong. Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't remember which came first. I don't know. We end off Numbers ready for the conquest, ready for what we end up getting to in Joshua, the book of Joshua, right? Actually going in and taking over the land. What do we have beforehand? What's in between where we are now and the book of Joshua?
Well, Moses is dead.
I mean, like what book?
Oh, Deuteronomy. Well,
Deuteronomy.
Moses gives the whole
So-
last.
So we're going to camp out at the end of Numbers, and we're going to set up and have we would call it a come to Jesus moment, right? Where Moses is commissioning the people before they leave, because they're going to leave him behind. So all of Deuteronomy is recounting and retelling and encouraging and reinvigorating the people before they go in for the conquest. I think we talked about it a second ago. We isolate Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers as a 4-book story. Deuteronomy is called Deuteronomy because it's a second telling, second law, right? We will get into it in the book, but there's debate about which actually came first. If Deuteronomy existed by itself first, and the other books came later as a way to flesh out the details, right? Or to gather like disparate material. We have this story over here, and this story over here, and this story over here, and we're going to bring them all together. We have no way of knowing, right? It's an argument that scholars will make. But when we get to Deuteronomy and when we're reading through it in preparation for Thursday, and we'll probably spend time on it also next Tuesday, keep that in mind, that it is not necessarily chronologically after the stuff in terms of it being written. We know in the story this is happening after the other stuff happened, right? But the stuff that it's saying, the way that it's written, might not necessarily be later. Does that make sense? Good? Okay. We will meet on Thursday, and let me know if you all have any questions or issues in the meantime. Good?